That is the idea, how do we create it, not really depend on one, and make it sustainable. So this roadmap is just an attempt to sort of figure that out, and if we can actually establish that system.
So we have a lot of the ecosystem which is already stepping up, and the biggest request that I've got from some of these teams is
The challenge is, where do we send the money? Like, how do we channel that money?
we focus too much on the allocation problem and too little on the eligibility question.
Open source is extremely important for decentralization.
We should remember Ethereum is strong because of this. We already have so many different ecosystems that are already supporting their dependencies.
Hello and welcome to Ecosystem Project Demo, a podcast where we dive into open source public good projects and funding initiatives supporting the Ethereum ecosystem. This is episode 23, brought to you by ECH Institute, and I'm your host Pooja Ranjan, joined by Valeen and Akash from the team. Today, we are diving deep into a crucial topic: funding Ethereum's open source infrastructure, the system and the software that keep Ethereum running, but often go underfunded and underappreciated. Joining us are two incredible guests who have been leading this conversation. Let me introduce Sejal Rekhan. She is exploring capital allocation at Allocapital, led grant innovation at Gitcoin, and spearheaded the inception of Greenpill Network. Sejal brings a dynamic perspective at the intersection of coordination, funding, and governance. Another guest today is Devansh Mehta. Devansh works at AI, Public Goods and Governance at Ethereum Foundation. People may follow his research and experiment at Deep Funding. He is a core contributor to the funding roadmap and brings a thoughtful system-oriented lens to Ethereum ecosystem sustainability. I would like to welcome you both to Ecosystem Project Demo. Thank you for joining us here today.
Yep. Thanks for having us, Pooja.
Yep,
I'm
excited about the conversation. Yeah.
I'm so grateful for you both to have here back again. I know you have been on our podcast talking about deep funding, talking about deep governance and things like that. So I'm so looking forward to talk more about this new initiative, this new roadmap. But before we get there, maybe if you can talk a little bit more about your experience in the ecosystem and what brings you to share this roadmap with the community.
So maybe I can start first about my experience in the ecosystem. So before I came into Web3, I was working as a journalist, working in a conflict area of India called the Maoist area of Central India, and a lot of it was writing grants and approaching traditional funders. And I survived on that for 4 or 5 years before getting very burnt out. And I stumbled into Web3 and crypto in 2021 of August, basically looking at the idea of how we can sell our impact by registering impact uniquely on a blockchain. We can then sell it and then get enough money to create the next impact. And no more grant applications, hopefully, after that. And I actually properly entered the ecosystem with quadratic funding. That's how I got the first support. That's how I earned my first crypto in like Web3. So that's basically the kind of short story of how I got in through quadratic funding. And once I got into these mechanisms, I found it fascinating how, in the traditional philanthropy world, you either get the entire grant or you get zero. But in quadratic funding, you can always walk away with some amount of money. And that's a very encouraging thing for newcomers to come, get some money, prove that you can manage the money well, get more money in the next round. So that's when I began to look at credibly neutral funding mechanisms. And eventually now I'm in the position where I'm trying to figure out how we can get more of these mechanisms and actually make funding less about power dynamics and enable cooperation without domination.
Hi, I'm Sejal, and I, started my journey in Web3 with Greenpill Network. Greenpill was the podcast that, Kevin Awaki runs. And when I stumbled upon Greenpill podcast, I was the one question that I had is how can we, bring some of these discussions and ideas and the tools that are being built at, in local community and where I live, right? Can we do it with the people around me. So that was the question that led me to sort of, come up with the idea of Green Pill Network, where we wanted to establish local communities so that these people can, discuss and share knowledge on public goods funding and everything that was being discussed in the podcast. And then eventually, can we export some of the tools or mechanisms that were built at the local level? That was the beginning. And initially, I was a grantee because I was running Green Pill Network, and we had, raised funds. We were raising funds from Gitcoin. So like Devansh, it was also very much like, quadratic funding to which I entered. And then that was definitely a point where I got more interested in exploring the different mechanisms. Like quadratic funding is interesting, like what else? So that's how I ended up at Gitcoin, where I further explored the mechanisms. And the other was easy RPGF that I worked on, which is pioneered by Optimism. And the idea was how we can democratize it, how we can enable anyone to actually, if somebody has to run a retro round, what do they need, like how do they design it? So that's how it happened. And then rest is history. So I'm still exploring the capital allocation design space, but now my interest is also, as much as it's important to explore the allocation side of things, I think it's extremely important to also talk about and acknowledge the fact that we don't yet have like sustainable ways of funding public goods. And where is the capital really coming from? So capital formation and accumulation is a part that is less talked about, which we have tried to talk about in our proposal. And that's where my current interest is. So yeah.
That's very fascinating. Both of you are having a very good background to talk about these things, and perhaps we would learn more about the roadmap. In the earlier episode, we also had an opportunity to talk to Agora team who contributed in like the optimism funding and things like that. So for our listeners and viewers, if you would want to learn more about these kind of public good fundings and the projects engaged, please check out Ethereum Cat Herders podcast ecosystem project demo, where we had talked about deep funding in length, deep gov in length, and Agora and similar projects like that. Well, moving forward with today's conversation, coming to the topic back, I would like to kick off this with the origin of roadmap. Like, what prompted you to write this roadmap? Were there any specific challenges or gap in the current funding ecosystem you were hoping to address? I know you already mentioned about these being underfunded. If you can maybe cite an example and especially focus on that.
Yeah, I can maybe start off with the impetus of it. And I have to credit Clement Losage, who's the CTO of Kleros, for actually giving that initial impetus, which eventually led to the creation of this post and the roadmap. So I think like the way Clement explained the public goods problem in the blockchain world is that imagine that there's some open source repo like Solidity, which benefits every team by say $10. So there are 10 teams in the ecosystem which are earning money. These are dApps which have smart contracts and they're making money. Each of them benefits by $10 from having Solidity. So the total benefit to the ecosystem is $100, but the cost to maintain Solidity is $60. So if any team individually decides to fund Solidity, they don't benefit from it because they are only gaining $10, but they are paying $60 to fund Solidity. But if everyone could somehow coordinate and get together and give $10, then the ecosystem as a whole is benefiting. Then all 10 teams are benefiting. So that's kind of in a very kind of sharp and clear way what the public goods problem to solve is. Like how have most blockchains solved it? So I'll give you two examples, one of which did try solving it and one of which didn't. So the most common way is what's called a pre-mine. So when you're just launching a blockchain, you keep some portion of the tokens with a foundation or with a DAO treasury, which can actually then pay for these public goods. So the foundation would then give money to Solidity. They would give the entire $60 required to maintain it. And that creates $100 of value for the ecosystem. And that results in the entire ecosystem benefiting. Like, so in a way, you can think of the pre-mine as like kicking the football down the road. It's kicking the can down the road that eventually pre-mine is limited. And we need a more sustainable solution after the pre-mine gets over. So that's kind of in a brief what the problem is. And before passing it over, I'll talk about the alternative, which is not having a pre-mine. And we saw that happen with Bitcoin, which famously doesn't have a pre-mine or even like a foundation similar to the other chains. And what we ended up seeing with Bitcoin was a lot of the development got captured by vested interests, which led to the block size wars and a bunch of other things because there wasn't a neutral entity that could decide the good for the whole ecosystem. There were different client teams that were pushing their own agenda, and that led to a lot of division and conflict. So that's the future that we are headed into unless blockchains solve the public goods problem. We are headed into a future where different teams will fund developers to work on the core protocol, but they also have their own vested interests and their own revenue models, which will result in no impartial steward. So, how do we not zombie walk into this issue is kind of the main focus of the proposal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Devansh has like given a really great like high level overview, and just to like bring it to specifically PGF or the things that we are currently seeing, right? One is that also, by the way, like thanks to Vitalik for his prompt. It was actually his prompt where he simply just said that, okay, what is it we should be doing, to increase the standard of public goods funding space in Ethereum ecosystem. So that was really one of the inspiration. We were like, we just ran with it. And the second was obviously, right now a lot of projects or sort of repos are dependent on one organization or maybe a few, but like essentially people look at EF to really look at EF for funding, and there is an expectation, okay, this is going to continue forever, right? Which is not really the case. So there is it's a reality that is finite runway, and it's extremely important for us to create system where people or ecosystems step up, right, as opposed to really looking at one organization. So that is the idea, how do we create it, not really depend on one, and make it sustainable. So this roadmap is just an attempt to sort of figure that out, and if we can actually establish that system, right? And of course the main part of it is like who, which is like the mapping of the whole ecosystem, where we have seen that deep funding is actually the beginning of it's an attempt. It was I think it's the first attempt to really map out the dependencies and challenge some of the traditional things that we are seeing in the mechanisms, which is like marketing and central sort of group or committee deciding who gets funded, right? This has led to just overfunded projects or underfunded, right? So I think mapping the whole ecosystem is extremely important, and then from there moving on to making sure like other ecosystems sort of step up is why we did this, and broadly what this roadmap entails.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see this coming up because I remember the conversation we had with defunding. I think at that time, this infrastructure was not very well covered and it was not like considered as kind of dependencies for many of those things. We were mostly looking into clients and softwares, but not these kind of dashboards and toolings which are available. So I'm very happy to see that. And I think the proposal has nicely put the problem statement. So thank you for explaining it one more time and making it more clear. I noticed there was the mention of Ethereum Foundation as kind of stopgap, and that can be a problem. Other than the limited resources, what else do you think can be a risk if we continue using this trend of depending upon Ethereum Foundation or any entity which are kind of pre-mined or trying to support the development over there?
So maybe I'll start with just saying that kind of a lot of the other ecosystem funders, and Ethereum is actually much further along in this regard, which is we have other funders like Octant and Gitcoin and Optimism's Retro PGF and Arbitrum supporting Prism, which is a core client of Ethereum. So we have a lot of the ecosystem which is already stepping up. And the biggest request that I've got from some of these teams is just help us channel the money well. I mean, that's the biggest request I've got, that there are so many repos. We don't know if the money is going to good repos. How do we even differentiate between good ones and bad ones? So I think that's the single biggest request that I've got, that like we have money, but we need to ensure that it's channeled in the right direction. So the recent Octant epoch, and I urge everyone to lock up some GLM tokens as soon as they can so that they can take part. But the recent Octant epoch is just to fund the core Ethereum development. So before, a lot of back channeling went into actually getting the teams which we have been supporting, like getting them to apply in the Octant round, and actually trying to make sure that the good teams that I personally know of apply in the Octant epoch. So that's kind of one small effort of how we shift the burden and how we let the ecosystem actually be wiser and smarter in the sort of public goods that it does support.
We would definitely like to get to know more about what public good is there. I mean, we'll try to cover this topic at the end because I know this comes every time. How do we consider that? But thank you for a shout out to the Octant Epoch 8. And we are happy to share that we are also have sent our application. We are one of those participants which we have participated since Epoch 0. And we are so thankful to the donors of Octant who have supported us for such a long period of time. And I hope with this specific round to Ethereum, many more projects which are trying to support Ethereum, not only just the development, but again, infrastructure and other core projects, they can get funded and can continue working in this direction. Thank you for sharing that. I would like to understand the roadmap phases. I noticed there is a mention of 3-phase roadmap: broad listening, the dashboard, and the 2% pledge. I understand we had briefly discussed broad listening when we were talking about deep governance, but for the context of this open source funding roadmap, could you maybe please explain what these 3 phases are and how people can navigate through it?
I do want to mention, like, quick disclaimer that, our thinking has been a bit updated. So there are things that, mentioned here which may not exactly be the how we see getting it executed, right? So, but I'll still walk through this so that we have an idea what was, where we were at initially, and we can also share some of the updated thinking that we have. So we've already covered the problem, that we talked about. So solution, like you said, Pooja, there are 3 phases. I'll give a high level and then Devansh can also get deeper into it. So broad listening, L2 beat style, dashboard, and Ethereum pledge. The idea with broad listening is right now, like, we said not just one organization, we also have other organizations who have stepped up. But the challenge is, where do we send the money? Like, how do we channel that money? So one is, can we use tools like Polis or Talk to the City to understand, like, what are people thinking? What are the people talking about, right? These conversations are happening, but how can we really surface the critical questions that will help organizations decide the eligibility criteria of their, funding rounds, right? So what really matters to the ecosystem, and what is the work that is worth supporting, what is critical. So I think that is one part of broad listing. And the other part that we have been thinking about, which, Devansh can also talk more about, is like, how do we map the whole ecosystem, right? How do we increase sort of the dependency graph for Ethereum, right? What is the way in which we can do that? And then it's important, first of all, we map so that, we have visibility in the hidden dependencies and the hidden projects that we right now, we probably don't know about, or, they're not getting funded. And second is then, of course, the goal would be to identify the critical ones and the ones that are vulnerable, and things that, if something goes wrong, can take the ecosystem, can take not the entire ecosystem, but can affect the ecosystem in ways that, would not be good. So I also consider that as part of broad listening, which is like, increasing sort of the graph and sort of expanding the graph. But yeah, that's phase one. And maybe just wanna like take a quick pause and let Devansh, double click on it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say that in a general trend I've noticed in the public goods and the mechanism designers is that we focus too much on the allocation problem, which is how do we distribute money in what proportion to different projects, and too little on the eligibility question, that how do we even decide which projects should take part in a round. And I would argue that the eligibility question is far more important. If there are only good projects in the round, then it doesn't matter if your allocation mechanism is imperfect. Because sure, like one project maybe got a bit more than another, but only good projects which are relevant to the ecosystem have even got money. So that's still a positive. So I think overall, a lot more effort and work from mechanism designers needs to focus on eligibility. And we've seen that in Octant as well, where Octant started off with a kind of direct democracy system of eligibility where any project could come and get votes and they get to take part in the epoch, which was capped at 24 to 30 projects. Like they don't accept more than those. But now they've actually shifted from a voting style system towards a curation style system where they have a team which decides, or they delegate it to another team that then decides who gets to take part in these epochs. And I really see that as like the way forward, like just try to constrain the number of projects that actually take part in a funding round and make sure that those are good. so that a little bit of up and down doesn't matter. But doing this in a decentralized way, in a way that there's no domination, is like a really hard problem. And that's something I don't have too many answers to.
Yeah. And you know what? One interesting thing that now that I think of it, I remember is when I had joined Gitcoin in GG19, there used to be a round which was called, ETH Infra round. And Gitcoin had a council of people from Ethereum ecosystem who used to decide, curate the projects that are going to go in that round. So it would be, but eventually, that was, the category doesn't exist anymore because we just made all the categories open source basically. But it would be really interesting to see or maybe compare Octan's Epoch 8, which is also like, infrastructure round, and what Gitcoin had done. And that was in a way broad listening, right? So, but anyway, that was just something that, reminded me of initial.
Like, I think they still have the round. It's called Web3 Infra. And when I saw the
Yeah,
list of projects, I was like joking to the Gitcoin team that, like, how many of these top projects in Web3 Infra do you even consider Web3 Infra?
exactly.
There were projects like Proof of Philanthropy, an identity protocol, which are probably like important, but they more belong to like the dApps around than like core infra. So I definitely think needing to tighten up the eligibility criteria is like the thing that's lacking currently in our space.
So yeah, so and that's one of the reasons we want to do broad listening, and when we map in, how can we come up with metrics and whatever is needed for us to really identify, what is critical and what should be considered, and then rest is important, but second level maybe later. So yeah, that's for phase one, broad listening. And then we go into phase two, which is, L2 beat style dashboard. One of the things that is extremely important, we feel, is visibility, right? Because a lot of funding is flowing, right? So where is the funding going? Who is getting funded, underfunded, and what are the gaps? And so that was the idea. And, we've seen the dashboards exist, but it's kind of sort of, when we were thinking about it, something like this for public goods funding doesn't really exist, right? Like, which feels very obvious, right? So it seems to be something that should exist. So that's why, we included this phase. And it's also sort of leaderboard, and credit to Devansh. I definitely want to shout out because Devansh should mention that, it's sort of like a leaderboard also, because, when you see who is funding what as an ecosystem, you have some sort of reputation also, right? That has come into picture, and you want to make sure like you are there, who's, what is that? You want to look into things that you're funding, right? So I think it just touches a lot of those things, which is why I feel like this phase is actually very exciting for me. And yeah, so that is phase two. But Devansh, you want to add anything? I just want to, but I think this is what is basically what we're thinking here.
Yeah, I think like something we've seen with L2 Beat is the amazing impact they've had on creating competition between rollups in getting decentralized. We actually have people fighting to become more decentralized, which I did not think was possible, but it's happening. And there's like a large part of that credit belongs to L2 Beat for being this neutral empire that actually looks into the code and sees exit windows and goes into the details. And it's a very manual process. So it's obviously quite cost intensive, but it's something which is taking the entire ecosystem forward and making the L2 roadmap successful. So I guess this is part of that similar framework, which is how do we make Ethereum alignment legible, and how do we make the consistency with our values? How do we make that clear cut and able to see it easily? So I guess the first step to that is like, if I asked you today, who is funding Ethereum public goods more, Arbitrum or Optimism? Like, Pooja, what would you say if I asked you that question? How would you respond to that today?
It's kind of difficult question. Definitely yes, because when we look into Arbitrum, the first thing that comes to mind is funding a client, and client could be like passively funding, not funding, but facilitating many other projects. So it could be funding all those projects together. But if I look at Optimism, Optimism has already opened the door and includes. So it's not funding anything specific other than layer 2 Optimism, but also helping layer 1. So difficult unless we know the numbers.
Yep, and I think you've encapsulated the problem statement very well, that it's difficult unless we know the numbers. But we can't create the same competition to support Ethereum unless we have the numbers. And I think that's kind of the rationale for this funding dashboard, that we actually do this very manual process of reaching out to teams, including their funding amounts to different ecosystems, and make it very visible and clear about who is funding what. And the last thing I'll say is that like phase one, which is the broad listening, ties in very clearly to phase two, which is the dashboard, in answering which funding counts and which funding does not count. So if we take the example of Optimism's retro PGF, its funding to protocol guilds certainly counts because that's supporting the Ethereum L1. Does its funding in retro PGF to Aerodrome count? Like probably not. Like, it's like Aerodrome is an app which is built on top of Ethereum. It's a dependent and it's not a dependency. And that's kind of the main difference. Like I love Aerodrome. I think they're great, but they are building on top of Ethereum. They are the leaves of the tree and they're not the roots of the tree. So I think kind of making those opinionated judgments about what counts in the dashboard and what doesn't count, I think that's the very controversial position that someone needs to start in this ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, one of the things, since Devansh mentioned Make Ethereum Legible, the blog that Vitalik has written, in the end, he, mentions that phase one will also help us identify the shared dependencies or shared infrastructure, which no one ecosystem is responsible to fund. It's really important to surface that and sort of make sure, that gets into the dashboard, and also like, everybody shares responsibility to fund that. But yeah. So that is phase two. I do want to shout out to Carl Carbone and Kevin Walkie, who actually did a hackathon project called Practical Pluralism Dashboard, which was done in Zuzalu, Istanbul. And they actually tried to map where the funding is coming from and who is getting funded. So it's a nice little dashboard if anybody wants to, have a look. Yeah. Great. So that is phase two, now. So phase one, we have sort of surfaced what are the dependencies, what needs funding, and phase two, we have sort of visualized it, right? And now obviously phase three feels pretty natural, which is like get the funding, right, to fund. So that is what our phase three is, which is Ethereum pre-commitment, ecosystem-wide funder. Essentially, how do we get ecosystems to really, commit? Like, where is the funding going to come from, right? So first step, it feels like, as an ecosystem, if you commit a percentage of your revenue to your dependencies, like that feels very sort of the natural thing to do. I want to let Devansh talk more about this because this was, originally Devansh's idea.
Yeah, I can do that. And you've been doing a good job so far of like summarizing it and all of that. So don't question that. Like you're doing good. But basically, what I'll say about the 2% pledge of revenue is that first thing is that we need to move beyond this public goods framing and that it's charity and it's something which you're doing, which is nice. Philosophers call it a supererogatory act. So, supererogatory act is something which is good to do, but it's not bad to not do. So making a donation is something which is good to do. But if I don't donate, it's not bad that I've not donated. And I'm not going to go to hell because I didn't donate. So that's called like a supererogatory act. So basically, that's how public goods is seen today, as a supererogatory act. And the first step really is changing that framing. And a large part of that is going to be like kind of the framing that we've proposed is integrating your cost centers and your revenue centers. So if you look at something like Twitter, the reason they can build such a good product is that the profit center, which is the ad division, is giving money to a cost center like community notes, and that creates a better end product for the customer. So the integration of the profit and the cost centers is done with a C-suite, with a management, a CEO and a CFO, who basically take money from the ad division and give it to the community notes division. And the ad division can't really complain about that. And they have no real authority to try vetoing that or anything of that sort. So there's no domination between the profit and the cost centers in the Web 2 traditional counterparts. But when we come to networks like Ethereum, the same picture doesn't actually hold. We have profit centers like Curve and Aave and Aerodrome and a lot of others. And we have cost centers like Viper, Solidity, and others. But there's no integration between these profit and these cost centers. So that's basically the first step that we propose. Like, how do we actually, if we want to compete with Web 2, we need better integration of our profit and cost centers. So how do we do that? Or what is our proposal? Now, there are obviously many ways we can go about doing that. The one that we propose is every project creates its own dependency graph. So something like Curve Finance uses Viper. So asking Curve Finance to give money to Solidity doesn't make any sense for anyone. Curve Finance uses Viper, they don't use Solidity. 0% of their money should go to Solidity and more should go to Viper. So that's the first step, generate a dependency graph so that you can see which are all the cost centers that are contributing to you being a profit center. Once you generate that dependency graph, you can then figure out an allocation mechanism to get weights between these different cost centers. So you can use things like deep funding, where you have a jury which gives ratings and models which try to align with those human ratings, and then the models decide the weights. You can use quadratic funding, and quadratic voting, where you can vote between the different cost centers and that decides the weights. You can use futarchy, you can use badge holder voting. There are many different techniques, but the basic step is Aerodrome should map out all of its dependencies, and we have that graph, and then we figure out weights on the graph. So let's assume we've done all of that. We've managed to make it easy for any revenue generating app on Ethereum to map out its dependencies. What is the next step? So the next step we propose is that 2% of the revenue that they earn goes towards these dependencies and these cost centers based on the weights that are obtained. And we can even make this enforceable at the code level, where when revenue is earned, it automatically gets distributed across the entire dependency graph. And this kind of, just to tie everything back together, about the example of Solidity, which is contributing $100 to the ecosystem, but its cost to maintain Solidity is $60, and there are 10 projects which benefit $10 each. So each of these projects would now put some money towards Solidity, which is part of their dependency graph, and then that can go towards eventually making Solidity kind of reach its $60, and each of those projects contributing $10 or whatever share they find valuable based on the weights in the graph. That's kind of the long-term solution, and hopefully that will then create redundancy. We don't require any exogenous funding from a pre-mine or anything to fund these sort of public goods, because every project is creating its own dependency graph, is able to fund it, and they're doing it not out of altruism, but they're doing it because they need to integrate their profit centers and the cost centers for a good product. And the last example I'll give before ending is to go back to the example of Curve Finance. Some years ago, there was a vulnerability in Viper as a programming language, and that caused Curve Finance to lose some money. So that's kind of highlighting the need of why this is not altruism. Like Curve Finance giving money to Viper results in a more secure programming language, which results in a more secure Viper. So that's kind of the framing that we are hoping to move towards.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Devansh. And just to like Devansh, just to summarize, the idea is to arrive at a point where any ecosystem is able to generate their own dependency graph, and then they can commit 2% of their revenue to that graph. And once the graph is generated, it's really up to the ecosystem what is that they want to use to give weighting to the repos or projects. Right, deep funding is one way of doing that, like running contest, but there can be other mechanisms that can be used to do the weighting of the projects. So that is phase 3. I do want to make sure, just want to highlight, please do check out deepfunding.app, which is a very nice UI. It was just like a fun thing that one of our friends, Carl, built, and it's pretty nice. And hopefully we have something like this for eventually, so that, you just have to type a node name and you can just it will list all the dependencies, right? And it will be like a one-click thing for you to just fund the dependencies. So that would be, ideal. But yeah, just in case anyone is interested in checking out. Also, just hear some of the estimates that we have shared. If like ENS has $31 million revenue, then what would 2% of it would be, right? So this would give you a good estimate on what these numbers would look like. And of course, one of the things that we are also planning to do as part of this phase is to sort of increase the list and sort of collect this data as well, right? How much revenue, so that we can estimate and project, how much will we sort of manage to get in funding if we get 2% of the revenue for each of these ecosystems. So, and our goal is, yeah, we're still defining the goal. I don't want to just throw any number, but it's definitely depends on these numbers. And then there's another part which is actually pretty nice, which is, we are saying we need to do for game theory what we did for cryptography. So essentially, we believe that there is an entire community of people who are economists, public goods experts, and, game theorists. But it's important for them to come to Ethereum or come to our space because we need more innovation. We need more innovative solutions, innovative mechanisms, innovative ways of thinking, right? That we strongly believe will definitely come from academia. So we are making an attempt to bridge this gap or do this by organizing a research retreat. And thanks to Juan Benet, who is the founder of Protocol Labs, and he also strongly believes in it, and he has agreed to sort of support this financially. And we are organizing this retreat in Iceland from July 26th to August 10th. And the idea is, like I said, it's important for the community, which is Ethereum outside crypto, to feel safe and see Ethereum as playground for them, as a ground for them to really do experiments and, test out their ideas, right? So, we will bring people from both the worlds, from our space and from academics world together to work on some of the things that we've also discussed previously, which is around credit assignment and reward loops. Once we have the repos, once we have the graph, right, how do we figure out the weighting? How do we figure out which what matters more? So essentially, everything, as you can see, is so well, ties together a lot, different pieces. It feels like, the more I was telling Devansh the other day, everything has come together very naturally. Like it was not something that, we had planned, but the way things are falling in place, it feels like, we are trying to solve for things in like different ways, and all of it has come together very nicely. So, which I'm very happy to see. So that is the end of the roadmap. I hope this helps with the people to like understand what this is. And just to summarize, there are three phases. Phase one is broad listening and dependency mapping. And then phase two is the dashboard. And then phase three is commitment, where 2% we will asking for commitment of 2% of revenue from ecosystems to the dependency graph. And then the retreat. And we are very looking forward to implementing this, executing this, and we are open to like teams and people who are really interested in doing further research and help us in implementing some of these things. So yeah, open to also chatting with them.
Yeah, the main thing we need help on is a name for this project. So if any of you have a name, that's always helpful.
Yeah, right now it's a roadmap for funding Ethereum's open source infrastructure, which is nice, but we need an interesting name. So it would have to be nice to have a fun name. And we have a history of, by the way, deciding name for deep funding. I think we should just chat a little bit about that. But when we were like working on deep funding, and one of the things that we realized how important it is to really have the right name. Like, this is one of the things, and thanks to one who actually got us to think more about what is the name of the mechanism, and because it can really tell what it is about, or otherwise it can be really misleading also. So I think name is super important.
It definitely is. And I think people have used this platform in the past to collect name and mascots and memes for testnets and things like that. So I hope people listen to this conversation and come back with some suggestions, some fun and interesting name. So you will definitely going to get that. Thank you both for articulating it in a very well way. I love the explanation with the curve finance and the Viper. It helped understand the relationship, the dependency that we are actually talking about. And learning about the revenue, like from where the fund will come. This is a very good proposal, but I think people have also shared this concern, and I would be also curious to learn more about it. Without the commitment, without the enforcement, it is just symbolic. How do you see this getting enforced, or and people getting encouraged to commit to this 2% revenue sharing with the open source infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's also the thing that we learned on Twitter, that like a lot of people said that this is where it'll fall short, like getting enough people to commit. So I think there are two, three things of it. One is the leaderboard helps provide an incentive that we can mark those who've done this commitment, and they can keep moving up the leaderboard as they contribute more and more to their own dependencies. So that's one part of it. The second part is a lot of ecosystems do actually want to fund their dependencies. And the reason is that it makes them have a better product. So that's the second part, that like projects want to fund the things they depend on, but they don't know how to do that in a very simple way that has little overhead. So the second hope is that by just making it super easy to do it, it becomes much easier for projects to do, and it doesn't take any cost of their time, because the main cost for these projects is the time of their executives. And if you can show a way to do that with minimal overhead, there'll be more people who do that. And there are already a lot of people doing it. I think we should remember Ethereum is strong because of this. We already have so many different ecosystems that are already supporting their dependencies. So that's the second part. So first is the visibility of a leaderboard. Second is making it super convenient and easy. And then the third, which is the more complicated one, is how do we build relationships between the dependencies and the projects? Because in a way, it's a win-win relationship, that as someone who's making Solidity, it benefits me to know how people are using my programming language. Then I know what features to focus on. And it's like basically talk to your users. So that's also what we eventually see happening, that the projects that are taking this pledge and supporting their dependency graph also get greater access to the cost centers and to the developers. And hopefully we get a win-win relationship formed through that. That obviously has its own issues and it has its own problems, but we've seen some models succeed with it. But I guess those are the three things that I would say as an answer to that.
Yeah, just to quickly add, like as much as like eventually the goal is and the success would be to get this commitment, but we would also consider it a success once we have managed to map this, and that feeds into the eligibility for Octant and for Gitcoin and these ecosystems when they run rounds, because it is extremely important. It feels like a low-hanging fruit almost, like doing that first and fixing that, sort of like helping them tighten the eligibility through this would be, I think I would consider it as a success. And then, of course, the next thing would be to get the commitment.
I may have a suggestion here as well. Like Devansh mentioned about few points, under which one of those were like convenience. If it is convenient for projects to do that, perhaps we can create a standard. For example, we created ERC20, and that helped a tons of projects to build on top of Ethereum. So if we can create a standard by which using a project can just simply donate their 2% revenue, that would be way easier and project might want to implement. So any author interested may work on that part.
No, that's a great one. Yeah, like I did not relate it to ERC20s, but you want to make it as easy as that. You're right.
That's a good.
Very well. My next question is with respect to dependency. Of course, we talked about that people will have their own dependency graph, but as we understand that dependency may vary, how do we want to have a good balance of past dependency and future dependency when we are talking about it?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. We saw this happen with Web3 JS, which is now deprecated. It's not active anymore, but they've still made contributions in the past. And so, how do we weigh that past versus future? It's like not an easy answer, but like it's something we're thinking on right now. And one solution we got just today is create one model to give weights based on usage by a repo. So there's like a model that we build as a team, and that gives like an initial draft that this repo is worth this much, this other repo is worth that other much. Then we have humans come in the loop to give judgments on each of the repos. And then that changes the weights based on the human judgment for the final model, which is then selected. So model, human, model. And that can hopefully, by looking at actual usage, like the reason Web3 JS was deprecated was that they found that a lot of teams have now switched to using Veeam or Ethers JS instead. So that's kind of, it would ideally be identified at the dependency graph stage that people are not using Web3 JS anymore. It's something in the past, but now they are very dependent on Ethers JS or Veeam. So that's kind of the hope, that we would be able to identify all of these without involving any humans, because we saw that humans actually gave high marks to Web3 JS, and they didn't know actually a lot of these things about it being deprecated, not being used anymore, all of that.
That is true. Yeah, Ethereum and in fact any ecosystem keeps on evolving. And as we evolve, we need to make sure that we are supporting new projects so we can have the fruits later down in the future. So we need to be mindful of that, and having a process in place to identify which is future oriented would be nicer to have embedded in this roadmap. Well, we had a lot of discussion on how to fund this open source infrastructure. One question that perhaps we all know, but it will be really interesting to hear from you both, for those people who may have missed the importance. Why does open source infrastructure matter, especially in the context of Ethereum or blockchain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think open source is extremely important for decentralization. And like, this is what we really, depend on. Like, if we do not immediately take any action to sustain open source infrastructure, which is inherently does not have a business model, it is extremely hard to imagine, like, in a decade or so, like, if this ecosystem will even exist, right? So I feel a very strong sense of urgency when I think about it. And I think, yeah, that's why it's really important to do it. And yeah.
Definitely, you touched on it, and it's good. We all understand that Ethereum is a decentralized ecosystem, and as we make it open source, it could be helpful for any contributor from any part of the world to come join, contribute, and add their idea, which perhaps the initial contributor may not have it. So that's I feel like it's very important to have it open sourced.
Yep, I can also give my answer to it. It's basically that open source is important for three main reasons. The first is that it just lets us build a much better internet. We've seen the internet splinter off into these walled gardens where when I'm locked into Twitter, I can't take that social graph into Facebook or Instagram, and then I'm locked in over there. So I think open source can help make like a better internet for everyone. The second is that it just makes a better work culture. People feel more motivated when their contributions are public. It can be built upon by anyone else. Someone who is able to even work part time is able to still get employment and make ends meet in open source. So I think in like blockchain in general, I'm sure all of us would agree working in the industry that it's actually like a much better way of working. It allows you to bring your whole self to work. So I think that's the second part, that it helps build a better work culture where we can build on top of each other rather than build against each other. And the third is just that it accelerates innovation, that by having to not repeat work which is already done once, like that open source ethos, if someone has solved a problem once, then it shouldn't be solved a second time. I think that can really accelerate innovation and the building blocks that are provided, that I made some base, you build on top of that. And then, so I think we can work much faster in open source compared to in a closed source model. So these would be the three reasons why I think it's important. Make a better internet, have a better work culture for the world, and accelerate innovation.
These are very good points. Definitely, it's adding value to the ecosystem we are trying to build around here. Well, while we are on this topic, I would also love to hear your thoughts on what qualifies as infrastructure. Like, how do you define open source infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess like in philosophy, we always taught to contrast things. Like I'll go on a slight tangent, but it's an interesting tangent. So the common philosophical problem is that when I was dreaming, I thought it was real, but now I'm awake. And how do I know that this is not a dream, that everything is a dream? So Wittgenstein was the person who actually got an answer to this, which I was happy with, where he said that we as humans have invented the word dream to contrast it with our waking state. So when you make a statement like, oh, everything could be a dream, you're playing a language game because we invented the word dream to contrast it with our waking state. So it's important to have that sort of contrast. So if we try to answer about what is Web3 infrastructure, I guess the contrast would be what is not Web3 infrastructure. And I think the way I define it is that anything which is user facing is not Web3 infrastructure, and anything which is dev facing is infrastructure. So something like Aave is facing the user, so that's not infrastructure. But something like Solidity is interfacing with the devs, and that counts as infrastructure.
I am a little divided on this thought or opinion because I feel like, when we are talking about dashboards, which may or may not be always dev facing, maybe user facing, but that could be considered as important part of infrastructure because that provides a lot of information here. So depending upon, the who the end users are, we can perhaps do that. But generally speaking, anything like dashboard should also be considered there. Well, I'm sure, as you mentioned in this conversation, that eligibility criteria is less focused. Perhaps we should do some more conversation around that. And how do we select these projects, like whether they are real infra or not? So we could have more conversation in upcoming days and we can get more clarity. We are coming towards the end of this conversation. Sorry, Sejal, you wanted to add something? Please go ahead.
No, this makes me think like of an experiment that we can actually do because, one of the things that we also keep asking is what is a public good? Like, how do we define it? So I wonder like if we use polis and then, use these statements and sort of make I don't know, few statements and just circulate it and see what people say. And then, using it, we can sort of make sense and actually see like what people are thinking and sort of cluster their sort of opinions and actually maybe use it as a way to arrive at a definition as an ecosystem. But yeah, that was just like a thought that came.
Yeah, and I think like one thing I'll say about public goods is that I like what Vitalik said about shifting away from public goods to dependency graphs, because public goods tries to answer the question, how valuable is X for the world, which is very hard to answer. Whereas dependency graphs is how valuable is X for Y, which is much easier to answer. So that's kind of one thing I like. Yeah.
Yeah, and to understand that dependency graph, these dashboard could be helpful because they can
Right.
provide the real data.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yep.
circular
Dashboards.
dependencies there. Anyway, we are heading towards the end of this conversation here today. I noticed that the roadmap received a lot of feedback, a lot of comment. So I'm curious to hear among these extensive feedbacks on the forum, what stood out to you the most, and if you have come up with any new plan or any new changes in the initial proposal based on the feedback that has been received so far.
Yeah, I can start. I think the first is definitely, for phase one broad listening, like I initially also mentioned, as much as it is, initially we in the proposal we've only focused on sort of scraping the forums and talking to people, which is important, but it is extremely important to also map the whole ecosystem, which I very much consider part of broad listening, right? So we need to broad listen to sort of ecosystems and understand like what really needs to be mapped and, map it. So that has to, I think that is important. So not just rely on conversations, but actually, look at the code. So that is one. And I think the second thing for the dashboard, one thing that I've been hearing is like, it's hard to collect the data because not everything is on chain. So like figuring out a way to do that. And also like there have been some organizations or ecosystems who have worked in the past. For example, MetaGov has done the DAO standard and there are few things that already exist. So I think one of people have highlighted that, it's important to not reinvent the wheel. So how we can use that and build on top of it. Right. So that would be, I think, important and that we've been hearing. And the third thing that I think you had also asked is like, how do we ensure that not only the past work is getting funded and, how do we make sure it also accommodates for future sort of innovations and, maybe dependencies, we are yet to see. And definitely, one of the interesting things that I've been hearing is like, this is great, but how do we use it for, Ethereum is not just open source, right? There's community, there is like people, there are different other things also. How do we do something for non-code, right? Like non-software things. So what would that be? So I think that is something that, it's not like less of concern, but more of like probably curiosity and interest from people. So I think those are broadly the things that come to my mind, which, I've been hearing. But yeah, Devansh, what do you?
Yeah, I think one of the great feedbacks that I've got is to look at the list of GitHub repos in Electric Capital. So they kind of compile all the repos that are relevant to Ethereum and to EVM, and to use that as a starting point of analysis, so that it also gets more people to add their repo to Electric Capital, which is kind of important to remain on top of that as well. So that's kind of one good feedback I got of like, use like broad listening, like look at the Electric Capital list of GitHub repos, which I think are 4,000 for EVM and around 2,000 for Ethereum. So that's a lot of repos to already look into. And I guess on the dashboard side, I think it's similar to what Sejal said, like just like it's hard to do it in an automated way. And it's hard, it also adds a lot of overhead to teams which don't have the time to share all this data with us. And so it's going to be like an onerous process to actually get this going. And on the dependency graph, I guess like we've been getting a lot of feedback on dependency graphs and how to run these competitions in a good way. One of the things was just like the Sybil analysis problem that people try to submit a lot of models, which like in order to give weights, how do we run these things in an on-chain way, rather than using a lot of off-chain technology, which is like GitHub and others. How can we run these entire dependency graph systems on chain, make it collusion resistant? So those are some of the discussions that we've been having on all three.
I have noticed public responses generally helps people who are into building get their ideas even more refined and maybe more useful. While they have started with some initial thought, these suggestions brings it more and it becomes even more helpful for the community. So I'm glad that we are receiving good input. It's been I think about a month, not a month has completed, but a decent number of input has been provided there. I wonder if you guys want to share any message to our community from this platform, any shout outs, acknowledgements. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, just like need help with coming up with a name for this sort of kind of initiative of the dashboard and getting the commitment, all of that. And the second is that we have like a deep funding competition live. So anyone who wants to kind of try out AI and get their hands dirty with it, we have a very concrete challenge for you, which is that we have a dependency graph of 4,000 open source repos that contribute to Ethereum, and we need weights between those repos. So build an AI or a deterministic model that gives those weights, and kind of be part of this first experiment on dependency graphs.
Yeah, and I think I want to mention that we have the retreat coming up, so applications are still open. The link is on the forum. Please fill your application if you're interested in joining us, especially if you're an engineer, if you're a researcher, and if you can take out time for 2 weeks in Iceland. We would love to have you. Yeah, so make sure you apply.
It's tempting. Iceland. Yeah, I think it's a good place for these kind of people to get together, cool down their heads, and think about good, public good. Very good selection of venue. Well, thank you again for joining us here, you both. It is really interesting to learn about different new ideas coming in the ecosystem. And it's important that people are thinking and putting them in form of a roadmap. We want to have Ethereum sustain here for longer, and thinking about long-term sustainability is a must. Thank you for initiating this process, and I look forward to see this going in the right direction and maybe getting a lot of support from the ecosystem itself.
Thank you for having us, Pooja.
It's my pleasure all the time. Well, all our listeners, please check out our show notes. We have multiple discussions on public good fundings, the governance, and what's there in the ecosystem to help and support if you are a new project and trying to survive. Please check out our links. Until next time, we request you to think more about these innovating ideas and, if possible, keep supporting other projects in the ecosystem. This is Pooja Ranjan signing off. Cheers, everyone.